Listen carefully because this story was never meant to survive. Somewhere between the lie we call history and the truth buried beneath it, a single act of mercy detonated a silent war no textbook dares to name. One man gave water to a woman the system said was property. By dawn, the system answered with 300 living ghosts. This did not happen in a city. Power never reveals itself where witnesses gather. It happened in the borderlands, where law dissolves into convenience and morality is enforced at gunpoint. The year was 1857, when America preached freedom with one hand and hunted humans with the other. The papers will tell you this era was chaotic. That is a lie. Chaos benefits no one. What existed instead was control deliberate, invisible, and absolute. Thomas Harlan believed he had escaped it. He fled eastward arguments, fled inherited loyalties, fled the demand that a man choose sides in a moral war engineered by institutions too large to see as enemies. He chose land. Isolation. Silence. He believed neutrality was freedom. That if he kept his head down, planted his crops, spoke to no one, the great machinery grinding men into categories would pass him by. That is the first forbidden truth, the machine always finds you. Harlan's homestead sat where maps grew vague. Kansas territory bled into Missouri like an unhealed wound. Slave catchers, patrols, and bounty men moved through this region not as criminals, but as agents of the law. The Fugitive Slave Act did not merely allow brutality, it required participation. Every citizen was conscripted. To refuse was to become an enemy of order. Harlan told himself he was invisible. A man alone with a mule and a well does not matter to history. But power does not measure significance in numbers. It measures leverage. Pressure points. Moral fault lines. When Delilah appeared on the horizon too tall, too broken, too deliberate, she was not just a fugitive. She was a test. A living indictment walking straight toward the lie Harlan told himself about staying neutral. She asked for water, not with pleading, but with certainty. As if she already knew the answer. As if she understood something Harlan did not. That is the second forbidden truth, those crushed longest learn the system better than those it protects. When Harlan lowered the bucket, history pivoted. Not loudly. Not with speeches or gunfire. Quietly. Like a lock clicking open in the dark. He believed the exchange ended there. Water given. Paths diverged. He was wrong. Because mercy is never invisible. It ripples. It signals. And in a world built on surveillance and fear, one small act can summon an army that has been waiting silent, disciplined, and desperate for someone to prove the machine is not absolute. By the time Harlan saw the footprints, it was already too late to pretend this was just a story. At dawn, the land confessed what the night had hidden. 300 bodies stood where emptiness had been. Not charging. Not begging. Waiting. Silence stretched tighter than any threat. This was not chaos. This was formation. Men raised to believe mobs are loud misunderstand power. True power whispers. It arranges itself patiently and forces the other side to move first. Harlan felt it immediately, the sensation that he was no longer alone on his land, no longer the owner of his choices. The circle around his cabin was not an accident. It was a boundary. He was inside it now. Delilah stood at the center like a keystone, her height not just physical but symbolic. In every age, systems create myths to justify their violence. They called enslaved people weak, childlike, incapable of coordination. What stood before Harlan was the exposure of that lie. Organization does not require permission. Discipline does not require literacy. Leadership does not require recognition. These people had traveled weeks without maps, without supplies, without legal existence. They had moved at night, erased tracks, rationed breath and sound. Children had been trained to cry into cloth. Elders had been carried when they could no longer walk. This was not a herd. It was a network. And networks terrify institutions. Delilah spoke not as a supplicant but as an emissary. She did not ask to be hidden. She stated terms. 2 weeks. Shelter. Silence. In return, nothing but the knowledge that Harland would still recognize himself when it was over. This is where the psychological trap closed. The law said Harland must betray them. The church said he must show mercy. The state said he must obey. His conscience said he already had. Power systems thrive on these collisions. They create moral dilemmas not to test virtue, but to force participation. Whatever he chose next would bind him to consequences designed by others. When Harland agreed, the machine marked him. Caves along the creek became a temporary city beneath the earth. Fires were forbidden. Movement restricted. Lookouts posted. The enslaved became shadows again, not because they were weak, but because survival demanded it. Harland became a courier, a risk vector, a liability. Every trip to his well, every glance toward the horizon carried the weight of collective death. This is the third forbidden truth: oppression trains its victims in logistics better than freedom ever does. At night, Harland listened to whispers from the cave's, songs without melody, prayers without doctrine. He realized something unsettling. These people were not afraid in the way he was. They had already died once, back on the plantations. What remained was something sharper. Purpose. And purpose is what the system cannot predict. While Harland feared discovery, the runaways feared delay. Every hour waiting for Moses, the rumored conductor, was another hour patrols recalibrated routes, another hour informants sharpened knives. Time itself had become an enemy. By the end of the third day, Harland understood, this was no longer about hiding. It was about endurance against a nation engineered to crush exactly this kind of resistance. On the fourth night, the watchers came. Not with lanterns. Not with badges. With absence. Horses that did not move. Birds that stopped calling. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Delilah felt it before anyone spoke. She had learned to read silence the way others read scripture. Slave patrols were not merely groups of armed men. They were extensions of a surveillance economy. Neighbors paid to inform. Clerks paid to look away. Judges paid to interpret cruelty as order. The frontier myth tells you this was lawless land. In truth, it was hyperregulated, just selectively enforced. Harland spotted the riders at a distance, silhouettes paused too long on a ridge. Not searching. Confirming. The machine does not rush. It narrows probabilities. Delilah reorganized the caves without discussion. Children moved deeper. Footpaths erased. Harland was instructed where to stand if questioned, what to say, how to lie without sounding like one. He realized then how thoroughly unprepared he had been for moral conflict. He had believed goodness was instinct. It is not. It is trained, or it collapses under pressure. That night, a child coughed. A single sound can collapse an entire resistance. Delilah covered the child's mouth, not cruelly, but with terrifying calm. The mother did not protest. This is what survival looks like when sentimentality has been beaten out of you. The machine counts on soft hearts making loud mistakes. The patrol passed. Barely. In the aftermath, Harland vomited behind his barn. Not from fear of capture but from the realization that he had benefited from a system that forced impossible choices onto others. He could walk away from this nightmare. They never could. This is the fourth forbidden truth: innocence is a luxury purchased with someone else's suffering. By day 7, rumors moved faster than riders. A bounty hunter was found dead near a creek miles away. No witnesses. No charges. The papers later called it an accident. But the message traveled underground faster than any headline. The runaways were not helpless. They were defended by distance, by numbers, by an emerging myth that something had changed in the prairie. Myths are weapons. Delilah never confirmed or denied involvement. She understood narrative control instinctively. Fear cuts both ways. When hunters believe prey can bite back, efficiency drops. Patrols hesitate. Mistakes increase. Harlan saw it then, the invisible war playing out beyond his fence line. This was not a hiding operation. It was a pressure campaign. Survive long enough, and the cost of pursuit outweighs the reward. Institutions retreat when exposure becomes expensive. But they never forgive. On the 10th day, Moses arrived. Not with trumpets. Not with certainty. She came disguised as a washerwoman, cart creaking, eyes downcast. Power often travels disguised as labor. Those who move history rarely look like heroes. Moses did not greet Delilah warmly. She assessed. Counted. Calculated risk. 300 was not a rescue. It was an extraction problem bordering on impossibility. Routes that handled dozens would fracture under hundreds. Every river crossing, every safe house, every sympathetic farmer became a liability. This is where myth and logistics collided. The Underground Railroad was never a single system. It was a patchwork of ego, faith, fear, and betrayal. For every conductor, there were informants. For every sanctuary, a trap. Moses knew this. She had lost people to it. Buried them in unmarked ground and moved on because grief is a luxury fugitives cannot afford. The plan required splitting the group. Families separated. Children reassigned. Leadership decentralized. Delilah agreed without argument. She understood command means sacrificing certainty for survival. Harlan watched as the circle dissolved into units. The very thing that had terrified him 300 together was now a death sentence. Visibility kills. Dispersion saves. That night, the machine struck back. Federal marshals arrived with warrants written broadly enough to mean anything. Harboring. Conspiracy. Theft of property. The language of ownership is elastic when humans are reduced to assets. Harlan was dragged from his cabin, rifle confiscated, hands bound. He expected Delilah to flee. She did not. She stood in the open, unarmed, towering, forcing the marshals to acknowledge her humanity if only to deny it. While they argued jurisdiction, Moses moved the first wave into darkness. This is the fifth forbidden truth: resistance does not look like victory. It looks like delay bought with courage. Harlan was released by morning. No evidence. No bodies. No fugitives. Only footprints leading nowhere. The marshals left with threats instead of arrests. The machine hates inefficiency more than injustice. By sunrise, the prairie was empty again. History records nothing of what followed. That silence is intentional. Harlan's land was seized months later on unrelated claims. He returned east disgraced, labeled unreliable. Delilah's name appears nowhere in official records. Moses survived, though later stories claim she walked with a limp after that crossing. Of the 300, some made it north. Some vanished. Some were recaptured. Survival was uneven. It always is. But something irreversible occurred on that land. The myth of passive slaves cracked. The illusion of absolute control fractured. Whisper networks expanded. Patrols overextended. Costs rose. The machine adjusted, but scars remained. This is how real change happens, not with speeches, but with stress fractures invisible until collapse. If you are listening to this, understand why they buried it. Not because it was tragic but because it was instructive. It reveals how systems maintain power, and how they lose it. Mercy as signal. Silence as weapon. Numbers as leverage. Narrative as shield. Halfway down this descent, you must choose whether you are merely consuming a story or recognizing a pattern. If you understand that freedom is never granted, only coordinated into existence, comment this phrase twice to mark yourself as someone who sees beneath the surface. I see the machine. I see the machine. Because once you recognize it, neutrality dies. And the knowledge you now carry is not safe, comfortable, or forgettable. It is dangerous. And it will change how you see every institution that asks for obedience in exchange for order. After the prairie emptied, the machine went to work rewriting memory. This is the part no one tells you about power. It does not only punish rebellion, it sterilizes it. It removes names, alters records, reframes causes. When violence fails, erasure finishes the job. The disappearance of 300 people should have triggered hearings, patrol expansions, sermons, editorials. Instead, there was paperwork. Reclassification. Land disputes. Clerical fog. Harlan became a footnote without context. Unreliable. Uncooperative. The accusation meant nothing and everything. It signaled to others what neutrality would cost them. He had not fired a shot. He had not made a speech. He had only failed to obstruct mercy. That alone was sufficient to exile him from legitimacy. This is the sixth forbidden truth: systems punish hesitation more harshly than open opposition, because hesitation spreads. In the years that followed, patrol budgets increased. Routes shifted. Laws tightened. The machine learned. It always does. But learning is not the same as healing. The stress fracture remained. Whisper networks along the border grew bolder. Slave catchers demanded higher fees. Some refused jobs outright. Fear had changed hands. And fear is currency. Delilah's legend mutated as it traveled. In some tellings she was a giantess. In others, a witch. In others, a general. These distortions were not accidents. Myths are what survive when facts are hunted. Each exaggeration protected the truth beneath it, that enslaved people could organize at scale, could hold discipline, could outthink the architecture built to contain them. That realization was more dangerous than any rifle. Harlan, older now, understood too late what he had touched. He had believed power lived in courts, militias, documents. He had been wrong. Power lives in coordination. In shared risk. In the moment when fear stops isolating people and starts binding them. He wrote letters that were never sent. Journals that were later confiscated. In one fragment recovered decades later, he wrote a sentence that explains why this story matters now: I thought I was alone. Then I learned aloneness is the first weapon they use. Understand this clearly: no system survives without convincing men they are isolated. You are not being told this story for nostalgia. You are hearing it because the architecture has not changed, only the tools. The patrols are quieter. The chains more abstract. The caves digital now. But the psychology is identical. Fragment people. Force moral dilemmas. Make participation compulsory. Punish coordination. Erase proof. The Fugitive Slave Act demanded citizens assist in capture. Modern systems demand compliance in subtler forms: data, silence, normalization. The mechanism is the same: turn the population into enforcers of rules they did not design. The frontier was not wild. It was experimental. Delilah understood something most never articulate: when enough people move together with discipline, legitimacy shifts. Authority begins to look fragile. That is why institutions obsess over lone heroes and ignore coordinated resistance. Lone heroes can be killed or discredited. Networks are harder. They adapt. This is the seventh forbidden truth: freedom movements fail when they become performances instead of logistics. The 300 were not saved by belief alone. They were saved by planning, sacrifice, silence, and the willingness to accept losses without collapsing. That is not romantic. It is brutal. And it is why history prefers inspirational lies to operational truths. Ask yourself why stories of resistance are always simplified. Why leaders are isolated from followers. Why outcomes are framed as inevitable. It is because inevitability anesthetizes you. If defeat is destiny, effort feels foolish. Harland learned otherwise. He lost his land. His standing. His illusion of safety. But he gained something rarer, sight. He saw how pressure is applied, how narratives are shaped, how quickly morality becomes criminality when it interferes with profit. If you feel unsettled, that is the point. Comfort is the machine's reward for obedience. The men who ran patrols believed themselves righteous. The clerks who erased records believed themselves neutral. The citizens who looked away believed themselves uninvolved. All were necessary. And all were replaceable. So here is the final descent: the knowledge that does not release you, but sharpens you. This story survived because someone failed to destroy every fragment. Because systems are vast, and vast things develop blind spots. The caves filled in. The land changed hands. But the pattern endured, waiting for someone capable of recognizing it again. You live inside structures just as real as those borderlands. They reward compliance, disguise coercion as stability, and label disruption as danger. They tell you coordination is extremism. That discipline is suspicion. That silence is peace. That is a lie older than America. Delilah did not ask for permission. Moses did not wait for consensus. Harlan did not intend to resist, and that is the most unsettling part. History is not moved only by the brave. It is moved by the moment ordinary men realize neutrality is a myth sold to preserve imbalance. Once you see the machine, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing how stories are framed, how blame is assigned, how fear is redirected downward instead of upward. You begin to recognize when you are being isolated on purpose. This knowledge is dangerous because it removes plausible deniability. The system depends on men believing they are alone, that their choices are small, that coordination is impossible. The 300 proved otherwise in the most hostile conditions imaginable. No internet. No allies with power. No legal standing. Only shared risk and absolute clarity about the enemy. And they cracked the illusion. This is why their story was buried. Not because it was violent, but because it was instructional. It teaches that power is not monolithic. That it leaks. That it fears groups who can wait, move quietly, and endure discomfort longer than authority can tolerate exposure. If you feel changed, that is because you are now carrying a pattern, not a tale. And patterns demand decisions. History will not ask whether you agree with it. It will ask whether you recognized it in time. The ranch is gone. The footprints faded. The machine adapted. But it never forgot. And now neither will you.